I'm going to talk today about some of the same things that Kevin did and try to provide a perspective on the dynamics that create this problem of counterfeits. At Arrow, we act essentially like a cross-point switch for the industry. And every single day, we see millions of transactions come across our systems through our sales offices in 52 countries, 30,000 live customers that show us trends. And hopefully I can share with you a perspective on how those trends indicate dynamics we need to understand better and maybe mitigate for as we think about how we deal with counterfeits. So I want to talk a little bit about these dynamics of this world that we live in, the structural constraints that create conflict that, in my mind, are going to continue to create situations where bad actors are going to leak into the supply chain. I want to talk about some of the tools that are available to you. There's really good news in that space, actually, and some tools that rigorous users can adopt that I think are going to help us deal with this in a bit more of a proactive fashion. And then I think a lot of this goes to some of the things that Henry was talking about in terms of developing and considering risk differently and assigning responsibility for managing risk differently than we do today, or at least than we do in a very broad sense inside of the industry. And hopefully then we'll sort of knit all of this together at the end to something that looks like a solution that component users might be able to take back or take pieces back to your own organizations and begin adopting and at least start making some progress on this program, or on this problem that seems to be getting away from us in some degree. So 50 years ago, Gordon Moore posited that transistor densities would double every single year. And that's largely been true. And though that creates a situation where we've got increasingly cost-effective use of microelectronics across everything from the RFID tags that are in some of our clothes to the dozens of microcomputers in our cars and trucks, it creates this cadence of new design, growth of the business, a decline of that business, discontinuance, and then redesign. And that's the cadence for all of the semiconductor suppliers that we represent. Every one of those companies works in this dynamic. And that comes in complete opposition to the needs of most of the users in the world. Unless you're building very, very high volume consumer electronics, you're going to get sideways with that cadence at some point in the future. So for A&D customers, this conflict gets even more pronounced, and I know all of you feel this, the need for 30-year life cycle support, maintaining interoperability in these very, very complex systems, customers that can only share or commit to a certain amount of forecast or volume, and then this whole conflict that I just described with Moore's Law. And in the context of all of that, suddenly open market acquisition of material starts to look like a rational choice. And we see that every single day. So from our perspective, what's going on with counterfeiters, admittedly they're bad actors. These are not people that have our best interests in mind. But they're actually a natural outgrowth of this chronic supply-demand imbalance that goes on every single day. You have suppliers running out ahead of us as fast as they possibly can, leaving this vast gap for somebody to fill. So how do you do that? How do you fill that gap? How do you make sure that your designs are not going to be left behind? And I think a lot of the things that Henry described in terms of understanding risk become part of that puzzle. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about some other tools that you can adopt that'll help you manage that risk as well. But this is our environment, and we have to figure out how to avoid falling into that domain. When you're dealing with a supplier, you're sitting down with an Intel, you're sitting down with a Texas Instruments, and I don't mean to vilify these folks, because in every case I would say they are dealing with this market as best they can, and in some cases I think it borders on a patriotic mission for them to properly serve this market. But the market dynamics that they have to perform to are maximize new designs. They've got to be able to sell their new technology. That's where profits come from for them. They have to grow market share. Their shareholders demand that they compete against every other supplier in the world. And it's the management of TI's job to make sure that they outship Freescale, Samsung, Intel, ST, NXP every single quarter in terms of design growth. And then finally, they have to grow income for the shareholders. So that's what they have to do, and that's what drives this cadence that I talked about earlier. And this is where the conflict comes from. Nobody has it out for the customer, but they have interests that I think oppose what we try to get done every single day. And this idea of maintaining these really, really complex systems and also providing transparency to our customer base becomes extremely challenging. And then layer on top of that the fact that we have to deliver, I think, to what Kevin talked about, the B-52 that'll be around for, I think, nearly 90 years when that product is finally retired. So that's more or less the cold shower. And I think we all sort of have a good innate understanding of that at this point. But there are some tools out there that help. And the use of those tools, I think, first of all, starts with an understanding of who your partners are in this business. So the idea of a franchise is one that is critical when you start thinking about what the entity is that you're dealing with. A franchise distributor is described by a contract, and it's a nearly fiduciary responsibility to that OCM to represent them and provide a number of business-critical functions. Those functions include market reach. In the case of Aero, that's 30,000 customers that we touch every single day. And that is something that most semiconductor manufacturers could never manage on their own. It's technical support. Again, in our case, it's 1,000 EEs deployed in local markets as local feet on the street, delivering factory-trained support to customers that have real-world design challenges with those suppliers. Distributors are the bank. The financial capital that runs this business is largely managed, controlled, and supported through the distribution channel. The number of customers that go through franchise distribution for credit, consigned inventory, adds up to billions of dollars of working capital every single day. And that's a fundamental part of why suppliers demand this close working relationship that we have. It's warranty support. It's the front end to customers when they run into problems with the product. And most importantly, it's our responsibility to preserve and protect the quality, usability, and trade compliance of those products as they find their way through the global supply chain. So all of those things you can use as a test for who is it that I'm dealing with today. Do they perform these functions, or are they performing one of them on an opportunistic fashion? And that's what a franchise distributor is. If you look closely at how this relationship works, what you see is this interdependence between these companies that goes deep into different functional blocks of each organization. The connections leverage a distributor's footprint to deliver the capabilities for IT, automated data streams. Every single day we get PCNs, hundreds of PCNs in fact, inventory adjustments, cost adjustments, ship notices, all transmitted electronically, and then all of that cascades down to become immediately available to customers when appropriate in an automated fashion with information flowing directly from the OCM. And it's that interdependence that becomes so critical. And one of the most important pieces of the information that flows is what's going on with the life cycle. We get that information formally and informally. In the case of Aero North America, we have about 80 people in Denver who every single day spend their time speaking directly to people inside the factory. And they can be leveraged by you through your local franchise sales support or engineering support to get access to that information. And this is going to become very, very critical when I talk about some of the tools that you can also apply to this problem. So, one of the things that has evolved over the years are tools that help you look at the quality of your bill of material. This is a product provided by Silicon Expert. It's a bomb grading tool that allows you to look at the risk dimensions associated with life cycle and other acquisition dynamics for a particular list of parts. Now, I talked about some of the information a distributor could deliver to you directly, but no distributor has every supplier you're likely to have on the bill of material, though we're trying, and it's our objective to do that, but we're not going to get there. But a tool like this can help you at least see problems coming sooner. And this becomes a critical part of how you deal with the problem early on before it becomes a situation where you have to make these, what I call a Sophie's choice between this bad choice or this one, neither of which is fundamentally satisfactory to how you want to run your business. And so through tools like this, you can load up a bill of material, periodically measure it for risk, and understand in a refining way, maybe not a perfect way, where your risks are starting to emerge. And so we did this as a test case for a bill of material for the U.S. Army because we started to see an increasing dependence on these tools, and we wanted to understand when suppliers use this, how do we as a distributor at a factory and a field level need to respond to that? And so what we found out is we actually add a lot of synergy to this brighter pair of headlights that these analytics provide. What you have here are a couple of examples of tools, A and B, from different vendors, and they both yielded very similar results when you started to look at the risk associated with individual components. But what we saw was there was some ambiguity there, but it was pretty quickly obvious where that ambiguity existed. And what was also interesting was how quickly we were able to take that single data, that single bit of data, leverage the supplier factory access that we had, and get to results that are really actionable, things that you can actually make a business decision on. I think some of the things we've heard about is, I know it's bad, I don't know how bad it is. This is a tool that helps you get to a very, very specific situation. So leveraging the access that a franchise distributor can provide you, using tools like the BOM Manager I showed you to help you understand where these problems lie, and then rapidly drill in an efficient way to understand how you might actually respond to those challenges. But I think there also has to be a better way we, the enterprise, manage risk. When I went out and looked at how customers deal with this problem every day, I won't say that I was surprised, but when I started to think about the implications of what I was hearing, I became concerned. when an EOL occurs, the typical response we saw and we continue to see today is a buyer who gets the notice, sometimes a component engineer, who looks at the problem through the lens of their own metrics. How are they measured? What's their boss going to ask them to do as a result of this information? And so what you have are the frontline fighters in the problem making decisions based on PPV, return on invested capital, in a very, very short window of time, typically 1 quarter. I think in the most extreme case, in a period of 1 month. But in a short-sighted, narrowly understood set of interests, they are making decisions that are going to affect the enterprise, in some cases for 10 years, even more, and they're doing it based on individual interests that aren't well aligned with the long-term interests of the enterprise or that enterprise's customer. We saw some customers who approached this with a slightly more advanced response. That is, an EOL of a IC over a certain dollar amount might be escalated to somebody at the C level or somebody responsible for the overall supply chain. And you see a slightly different set of metrics there. They're going to look at OPEX compared against perhaps an annual plan, make decisions on that basis. But what we see far more infrequently than we would like to, or that I think is productive for the industry, is where an enterprise looks at these situations and really grasps the importance and the potential catastrophic impact that these things can have on the business. I'll share an anecdote, and I'll be accused will remain nameless, but a situation of an end of life that occurred in 2008 on a complex microprocessor, used on an airframe and used across, I think the number was less than 100 boards, but broadly used across this particular prime's portfolio. The decision about how many of those processors to buy was made in 2008 by a buyer. These are parts that, first of all, require full air qual. So tens of millions of dollars in requalification costs if they have to go that route. They're used across the entire product line that this particular division produces. And in many cases, they're in flight critical applications on the airframe. So how is it that the environment existed where that decision is being made by a person who's incentivized on PPV? How does that happen? Nobody was a villain in this case. I think it was just a misunderstanding or failed to grasp the incredible risk that these events create. And that's what we are driving hard to communicate when a customer calls and wants to know how they're going to respond to an EOL that has a last order date of tomorrow. We're pushing hard to get them to consider it in a very, very broad way. And yes, we're asking them to buy a lot more than that typical buyer probably would. And I guess on that basis, this looks like a very self-serving message because we're asking customers to go buy $10 million worth of processors when the buyer might be trying to buy $10,000 worth. But that's really not the point. The point is we're trying not to put our customers out of business. And those are the decisions that we have to combat. So we tried to understand how can we share with customers something that would allow them to look at a framework or a guide to help them navigate first their understanding and then their measurement of these risk factors. So ISO 31000 really defines risk. What does risk look like to the enterprise? And 31010 provides measurement tools that they can use to further understand, and I hesitate to say quantify, because I think Henry's right, that it's very challenging to get to a point where you can actually assign a score and a dollar figure to these decision points. But it's got to be better than where we are today. It's got to be better than putting that buyer out on the point of the spear and asking them to make a decision that can put the company out of business if they get it wrong. So I think if you look at this as a guide, perhaps, something for a COO or a division vice president to understand and evaluate, I think it's a productive starting point, at least, to keep score on how your company is dealing with this problem. Are you regularly looking at the emerging risk dynamics inside of all of your bills of material? Are you keeping a close eye on that stuff? Are you using tools like the ones available from Silicon Expert that allow you to see things coming sooner? Are you leveraging relationships with people that are probably in your business every single week that have direct, behind-the-curtain access to the original component manufacturers? The nice thing about a franchise distributor is we get invited into the factory on a regular basis. I spend half my time in Silicon Valley and in Asia in factories. Are you leveraging that access that we provide? And is there an adult in charge in your business? Is there somebody inside your organization that is taking a look at the Scud missile coming over into your balance sheet if you don't decide correctly on the next EOL event? Because these things can be catastrophic, and we've seen it. And so it's not about counterfeit, and I know that that's what this whole day has been about. But in my mind, it's how do we avoid ever getting to that point in the first place? And so I respect and appreciate and acknowledge that everything that G19 does is going to be absolutely necessary well past my tenure in this industry. And I acknowledge that there are open market players that are extremely important in a market clearing activity that uses the best processes they have available. But the ultimate solution to this problem, at least from an EOL perspective, and I'm not sure how well this applies to the tsunami event that Kevin talked about, but to an EOL event, the best thing you can possibly do is avoid it in the first place. And hopefully this structure and this roadmap gives us at least a place to start.